they say some stories never make it to the news. They drift instead, quietly and kindly, from porch to porch, from chatty cafes to cluttered corner libraries, passed along with a chuckle or a cup of warm tea. They are the kind of stories told while waiting for the kettle to boil, or while watching the sky change color over a sleepy stretch of road. This is one such story. It begins in a place where lighthouses outnumber stoplights, and the ocean is less of a visitor than it is a neighbor with moods. The town is called New Wimbrel, nestled along Maine's less famous coastline. A crooked arm of wooden houses, fishermen's docks, and pine trees that lean just slightly east, as if they too are listening to the stories carried in from the sea. The pace here is not hurried. The locals aren't in a rush, nor have they ever found much purpose in one. It is the sort of town where the grocery clerk knows you by your coffee order, and the library still stamps due dates by hand. Digital news comes late, if at all, but stories, they arrive right on time. Of all the tales whispered along dog-walking routes and behind church potlucks, one has stood out in recent years. Not because it was wild or scandalous, but because it stitched people together in quiet awe, the kind reserved for the small, important things we didn't know we'd been missing. And it began not with a hero, but with a cat, a portly, cross-eyed, much too serious rescue cat, whose most sworn and lifelong enemy was his own reflection. His name, given nobly by a man with a fondness for British detective dramas, was Sir Whiskerford, Lord of Teacup Manor. No teacups were present in the actual home, but the title, much like the cat himself, possessed a certain unnecessary grandeur. Sir Whiskerford was not born a knight. He did not come by honor through feats of valor or rigorous code. Rather, he was knighted by circumstance, plucked from a cluttered cage at a coastal shelter, and placed squarely into the life of a man who did not know, not yet, that he desperately needed something to love again. That man was Arnold March. Arnold, 67, had been a mailman once, not the kind who walks fast with earbuds in, but the kind who stopped to chat, who knew every dog by name and every kid by grade level. He once knew a whole neighborhood by heart, but after his wife of 42 years passed, a quiet, brave goodbye following a long illness, Arnold stopped walking, stopped smiling, stopped doing nearly everything, really, except sitting in a squeaky recliner and listening to the radio with the tuner slightly askew. He had no plans, no hobbies, and no particular desire for either. It was his friend Rita who suggested the shelter. "Just get out of the house," she said, like fun was supposed to smell like antiseptic and cat litter. He went to humor her, he said, just to look. Definitely not to bring anything home, but sometimes even the most reluctant of people walk right into the middle of a miracle. Arnold met Sir Whiskerford on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. At that moment, he was still going by a much less dramatic name, Beans, a name that fit, somehow, far too well. Beans was not particularly agile. In fact, when Arnold saw him, the cat had just knocked over his food bowl by turning too quickly, sending kibble like confetti across the linoleum floor. Seconds later, he attempted to investigate the damage, misjudged a corner, and walked directly, confidently, into a mop bucket. Through it all, he never looked away. Cross-eyed and dripping slightly, he stared Arnold down like a general preparing to issue orders. There was something about that look, a kind of absurd dignity that made Arnold bark out a laugh he hadn't heard in months. "He's like one of those British detectives," Arnold muttered. "Stuff falls down all around them, but somehow they always solve the case." 20 minutes later, Beans was no more. Sir Whiskerford had been born. The shelter receptionist raised an eyebrow when Arnold filled out the adoption form. "Lord of what now?" she asked, glancing at his scribble. "Teacup Manor," Arnold replied without missing a beat. "It's a fictional estate, very exclusive." It took less than an hour to transition from loneliness to companionship. A trunk of canned food rattled in the back seat. The cat rode shotgun in a cardboard carrier that had seen better days. eyeing his new roommate, with cautious neutrality. Arnold didn't expect much. A few purrs, a little company, but what he got was the beginning of a daily war, waged not with claws or cunning, but with absolute, perplexing confusion. The enemy? Glass. Smooth, flat, reflective glass. It started 3 days after settling in. Whiskerford was wandering the hallway like an amateur. Inspector sniffing outlets, batting ceiling cobwebs, when he turned a corner and froze. There stood something tall and narrow, glossy, an old, freestanding mirror that had belonged to Arnold's wife, forgotten in its place, gathering dust in the shadows. Sir Whiskerford saw it. Then he saw himself, and then he saw a threat, a rival, a fuzzy imposter dressed in his exact fur. What followed next could only be described as a declaration of war. Arnold March had not planned on sharing his home. After 42 years of navigating life with a partner, the silence had settled deep into the walls, thick, resinous, and undisturbed. But somehow, over the course of a single soggy afternoon and one gloriously uncoordinated feline, he'd brought home a roommate who immediately began to reorganize every quiet moment. The first evening, Sir Whiskerford explored the house with careful indignation, as if surveying property he hadn't technically purchased, but would nonetheless begin decorating as he saw fit. He inspected curtain cords with the seriousness of a building inspector. He attempted to climb a bookshelf and made it precisely 1 tier before deciding the ground had more dignity. When Arnold left an open can of cranberry sauce on the counter, abandoned from a microwave dinner neither of them had finished, the noble cat stuck a paw in it and walked away like his actions required no explanation. Each movement carried an air of entitlement, and Arnold found to his surprise that he didn't mind. It was like hosting a strange little guest who refused to introduce himself properly, but had no trouble making himself at home. For the first 3 days, Arnold kept to himself, watching from his chair as Sir Whiskerford prowled and settled. The radio hummed in the background, and the house, which once rang hollow, began to sound faintly lived in again. But it was on the 3rd morning that Arnold realized this arrangement would not be ordinary. It happened in the hallway. The house was still mostly dark. Arnold had just brewed a cup of tea and was meandering toward the phone to check the morning messages. Whiskerford, ever the independent scout, had wandered off. Then came the sound, an unmistakable thump, followed by a high-pitched scrabble, then silence. Arnold peeked around the corner, bracing for broken glass or perhaps a toppled coat rack. Instead, he found Sir Whiskerford locked in a dramatic standoff with the hallway mirror. The old antique stood at the end of the corridor, freestanding and slightly tilted from age. Whiskerford's reflection stared back at him, identically cross-eyed, magnificently. Unimpressed, and evidently that was the final straw. Without a sound, the cat arched his back, his tail puffed up like a bottle brush. Then, with a screechy yowl reserved for opera singers and very opinionated barn owls, he launched himself forward and smacked directly into the mirror. Arnold nearly dropped his tea. The attack was short-lived but emphatic. A nose bonk, a paw smack flurry, and then a hasty retreat under a side table, where Whiskerford watched the mirror through the narrow gap with the intense composure of a creature awaiting a duel at dawn. Arnold's eyebrows ascended. What in heaven's name did the mirror ever do to you? From beneath the furniture, a single paw twitched. He thought it might be a fluke, a burst of early morning confusion. Cats, after all, were famously quirky, and Whiskerford had never claimed to be operating at peak coordination. Surely, with time, the novelty would wear off. It did not. Each morning thereafter, the battle resumed. The mirror, tall and unmoving, standing like an ancient foe at the far end of the hallway, and Sir Whiskerford trotting out 5 minutes after breakfast as if summoned by some inner sense of duty, and attempting, with great drama and no success, to conquer his own image. The attacks grew more detailed. One morning, he advanced by crawling low to the floor like a practiced soldier. Another day, he tried sneaking up from the side, launching at the reflection's flank before skittering backward in utter dismay. He hissed, he arched, he pawed. He ran victory laps after particularly vigorous snarls. Sometimes he just sat there, glaring into the mirror with a look that could curdle soup. Arnold tried reasoning with him. "That's you, you fuzzy overreactor," he'd murmur, swatting crumbs off his robe. "You're mad about your own face." But Whiskerford paid no attention. His loyalty was not to logic, but to his mission, an impossible quest to vanquish a doppelganger who matched him blow for blow. Eventually, Arnold moved the mirror, dragged it with a quiet grunt into the guest room, where it leaned half-hidden behind the spare bed. The next morning, thinking the crisis resolved, Arnold shuffled into the kitchen to sip his tea in peace. But 20 minutes later, he found Whiskerford perched on the kitchen counter, glowering hatefully at the stainless steel toaster oven. The reflection there was smaller, but no less threatening. Later that week, the cat launched a surprise assault on the dishwasher door. By Saturday, he'd added the reflective underside of a messily polished soup ladle to his hit list. Arnold began writing it all down. What else could he do? First, it was just a few scribbles in the corner of a crossword book. But then the episodes grew more elaborate, the entries more formal. Mirror war log, Tuesday. Reflected adversary encountered at 0800. Engaged in brief skirmish behind recycling bin. Outcome inconclusive. Troop morale remains high. Soon, he'd started a proper journal. One of those old leather-bound notebooks his wife had once used for recipes. He called it the Chronicles of Reflectionia. Each entry documented the great battles, from the sconce ambush to the Siege of Spoon Hill. Whiskerford, it seemed, was building a legacy. And without quite trying, Arnold was laughing again. Quietly, then loudly, then constantly. The absurdity had broken something loose, and he welcomed it. Waves of chuckles catching him by surprise while putting out the trash, folding laundry, stirring soup. What had once been a weight was beginning, ever so gently, to lift. And every battle, however brief or ridiculous, seemed to patch some small wound. The house warmed not by temperature, but by mischief, mystery, and the unwavering, fantastically misguided courage of a cat who refused to back down from himself. It started small, a few polite comments on a Facebook post, a light flurry of laughing emojis. Someone from Arnold's high school, who still lived 2 towns over, asked if Whiskerford had military rank or if Sir was just honorary. Arnold replied, "Knighted for distinguished service in the Battle of the Dustpan." It got 37 likes and one reply that simply read, "Good." Encouraged, Arnold posted. Again, a minute-long video of Whiskerford stalking the gap under the couch, tail rippling in anticipation, before lunging out and slamming full speed into the reflection of himself on the black television screen. The camera shook as Arnold cackled behind it, nearly dropping his phone. That video did a little better, shared by a woman named Blanche who owned a bookstore downtown. And from there, it found its way into a pet lovers group covering southern Maine. By week's end, Whiskerford had a following. Nothing viral, not the sort they write headlines about, but something sweeter and more manageable. Like a rumor that everyone's in on. Each post drew in a few new people. Some left comments like, "My cat does this too," but mostly with shadows. "And this is the exact energy I needed today." One woman from Ellsworth wrote, "I didn't think I could smile this week. Thank your night for me." Arnold responded to every comment with care, often in character. "Sir Whiskerford read your words aloud at council this morning," he wrote once. "The Order of the Shiny Dish salutes you." At the local library, Esther, who ran story time on Wednesdays and could find anything with a paper index, printed out some of Arnold's Chronicles of Reflectionia and pinned them to the bulletin board by the front desk. Children started asking who the night cat was. Esther called it local lore in real time. Soon, cartoons appeared, crayon drawings signed in backwards R's and misspelled names. One depicted Whiskerford in a helmet made of jelly jars, facing off against a vaguely heart-shaped toaster. Another had him riding a spatula into battle. Arnold began storing them in a shoebox under the coffee table beside the journal. And then came the article. The New Wimbrel Gazette, a twice-monthly paper that mostly printed crossword solutions, church announcements, and the occasional lost mitten listing, ran a long-form piece titled The Mirror Crusades of Sir Whiskerford. It detailed Arnold's gentle transformation in soft, precise phrasing. How a widowed man rediscovered community through the gloriously confused warfare of a cat. There was a photo, too. Whiskerford mid-swat, Arnold just behind him, eyes creased in a way that hadn't happened since memory could last recall. After that, things began to shift, not in any big dramatic way, but as a series of welcomes. A man from the bakery dropped off cinnamon rolls with a note that read, "For the brave knight and the brave man." Kids began pointing when Arnold walked downtown. "That's Sir Whiskerford's person," one boy whispered with round-eyed awe. At first, Arnold didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to attention, especially not the warm kind, but over time, the stiffness in his shoulders softened. He started lingering at the corner cafe again, learned names he hadn't asked in years. One afternoon, he stayed all through a community knitting circle, even though he had no intention of touching a single skein of yarn. Whiskerford lay draped across his lap the whole time, offered him his own ball of leftover wool in the town's blue and white colors. Whiskerford accepted it once, dragging it down his carrier like a prized enemy pelt. Arnold's days became rhythmic again, but not the lonely, monotonous rhythm he'd known for months. This was a brighter percussion, built from comments replied to and stories jotted down, letters opened from people who'd simply wanted to say, "I know that kind of grief. Thank you for letting something lovely in." He began each morning like clockwork. Feed the cat, brew the tea, await the daily skirmish, the sprint, the yowl, the indignation, then document it. With a touch of drama and a splash of nonsense. One morning's log read, "The knight staged an ambush behind the laundry hamper. Enemy suffered severe static shock. Retreat deemed noble." And perhaps most healing of all, Arnold had begun talking again. Not just in the performative replies of an internet poster, but in real sentences to real people. Conversations over fences, grocery store greetings. One afternoon, a woman in her 80s, named Myrtle, stopped him beside the dollar book sale and asked, "Excuse me, but would yer, little general, mind visiting the senior center sometime? He might boost morale." Arnold agreed before he could think to hesitate. "He prefers a soft blanket and tuna encouragement," he quipped. Whiskerford naturally became a hit. Rolled around in laps, rolled off of laps, investigated walkers, knocked over 3 paper cups of cranberry juice, and returned each time to perch stoically on a window ledge like he was inspecting the troops. What surprised Arnold most wasn't the attention, but how easy it had become to accept it. How natural it felt to take up space again, not as half of something lost, but as a person who still had stories to tell. Even ridiculous ones, especially ridiculous ones. In time, Arnold began adding footnotes to his journal, commentary on the battles, reflections on grief, misfires with soup ladles. The Chronicles of Reflectionia became equal parts war record, community newsletter, and love letter to a hairy, confused cavalryman who never once questioned the value of his mission. He'd write it plainly on the last page of one volume. Sir Whiskerford believes his reflection to be the enemy. It's a fool's battle, yes, but fools are often the ones who teach us how to live again. It happened on a Tuesday, as many strangely significant things in small towns tend to. Sir Whiskerford was inspecting the window ledge with great disapproval, having just lost a staring contest to his reflection in the toaster for the 3rd time that morning. Arnold, murmuring to himself about recipes he wouldn't make, absent-mindedly filmed the tail end of the chaos. The video began mid-pounce, Whiskerford hurtling across the linoleum like a bewhiskered cannonball, and ended with a fluffy thud against the dishwasher door. The reflection won tactically, but spiritually, the cat claimed victory. The footage was 24 seconds. Arnold captioned it simply, "The Knight claims the West Hall of Sudsey." Steele. He didn't think much of it, but the video found its audience quickly. Dozens of reactions. Then messages. A retired florist from Illinois who said she snorted into her soup. Someone from Nova Scotia asking if Sir Whiskerford would accept honorary membership into the International League of Inevitable Chaos. Arnold, surprised and a bit tickled, replied, "I shall summon the council." The next week, he posted excerpts from the Chronicles. Just one page at first, a dramatic retelling of the Duel of Lazy Susan, featuring a salad spinner turned traitor and one very brave feline who braved turbulent forces for the cause. Esther from the library printed the entry and taped it to the community board with gold star stickers in the corner. Children began bringing in their drawings. They called Whiskerford the Brave Fluff or Sir Swaddalot and debated, seriously, whether he'd ever defeat the evil mirror mage. At the deli counter, a boy named Theo asked Arnold if the cat was magical. Arnold replied, "He has the power of very selective hearing." Theo nodded like that made complete sense. One morning, on his way to refill a prescription, Arnold stopped by the bakery. Julia, 29 and always flour-dusted, handed him a brown paper bag with the word "For Sir" scrawled in pink marker. Inside was a tiny croissant, unsalted, made fresh that morning. "Knight's rations," she grinned. Whiskerford devoured it after sniffing it 4 times and nudging it behind a throw pillow. The local radio station, WNWB, New Wimbro's proudest source of weather updates and accordion heavy. Polkas reached out next. They asked Arnold if he'd like to do a short segment. "Just you talking about the cat," the station manager said. "People here seem to like hearing about him." Arnold hesitated. He agreed, and on a Wednesday afternoon, he read aloud from the Chronicles. Voice a little shaky, then steady with each paragraph. Listeners called in. Some laughed, others just said thank you. One woman, living alone outside of Cherryfield, said, "She'd moved her dusty mirror because I felt bad. What if my cat is fighting too, and I never noticed?" Arnold's handwriting changed in the journal, not in content, but in spirit. The lines grew more playful, the doodles beside them more frequent. A smiley face beside a battle map, a miniature sword drawn through a reflection, the margins filled with notes from neighbors and children. Next time, he should wear a cape, add fairy lights to his battlefield, and in a sweet, subtle turn that made Arnold stop mid-sentence one day, he noticed something in himself. His handwriting had begun to curve like it used to, back before the tremor in his hand came. One day, a woman with a purple raincoat and folding walker stopped Arnold outside the grocery store. With her was a teeny dog in a sweater. She said, "I haven't smiled this much since my Harold passed. That cat of yours has gumption." Arnold laughed. "He has something, that's for sure." And the woman patted his arm and said, "So do." You stood there a while after she left, bag of frozen peas tucked under one elbow. He thought about all the strangers who knew his cat's name, all the people who'd seen the absurdity and met it like a friend. Later that evening, Whiskerford launched a particularly committed charge at the reflective knob on the old stove. Arnold called it the Spiral Siege of Burner Castle. The entry earned 26 likes and a string of comments, debating whether Burner Castle indicated feudal or culinary themes. The next day, the mayor's office added a new flyer to the monthly newsletter, Pet Appreciation Week, featuring tales from New Wimbrell's legendary knight. Arnold didn't ask who wrote it. All he did was circle the date, jot a note in his calendar, find appropriate hat for Whiskerford, and smile. Not because things were perfect, but because imperfect could still be funny, still be good, still be shared, because sometimes the best kind of magic didn't come from wands or prophecies, but from a cross-eyed cat and the reflections he never stopped trying to defeat, and from a man who, without ever planning to, found himself reflected in something ridiculous, funny, and impossibly beer. It happened when the wind was all wrong. You know the kind. The sort that rattles shutters even when they're latched and makes treetops shudder like they've been caught saying something they shouldn't. A nor'easter. They called it up here, though Arnold always thought that word made it sound somehow more romantic than it really was. In reality, it meant drizzle that couldn't decide if it wanted to be sleet, a sky as gray as canned soup, and a cold draft that liked to find the seams in old socks. Arnold had spent most of the day inside. He'd rearranged the canned beans twice, handed Whiskerford a single green bean in an act of optimistic bonding, then watched in resigned admiration as the cat smacked it under the fridge like he was sealing a deal with the underworld. By evening, the storm had started in earnest. Wind flung handfuls of wet leaves against the windows like messy punctuation. Whiskerford, normally undisturbed by weather, sat unusually still on the couch armrest, feet tucked, eyes narrowed, tail twitching like he knew something Arnold didn't. It was during this still moment, somewhere between weather alerts on the radio and the clink of a spoon in lukewarm soup, that Arnold rose to check the back door and found it open, just barely, a shy few inches, enough for a breeze to whistle through, enough for a certain night to stage a tactical exit. Arnold's heart didn't so much drop as it did pause. He turned, scanned, couch, chair, windowsill. No Whiskerford. It was the kind of quiet that immediately felt wrong. "Whisk?" Arnold called lightly. "Sir Whiskerford?" Nothing, not even a judgmental yowl from beneath the radiator. He stepped out into the rain without even thinking to grab his coat. The yard was a blur of wet leaves and wandering wind. The porch light made halos in the drizzle, illuminating exactly no cats. Arnold called again, 3 times, then walked the perimeter in slippers, peering under the car, behind the compost bin, even beneath the old plastic lawn flamingo he'd never gotten around to removing. No flash of tail, no soggy paw prints, just rain and the expanding worry of an old man who hadn't realized how completely a small creature had moved into the space where grief used to be. He searched for 2 hours that night. Neighbors joined in. Even Rita came over with an umbrella and a determined expression. They called, they whistled, they rattled keychains and tapped cat food tins like amateur percussionists. Nothing. Arnold barely slept. The rain didn't stop until late Thursday, and even then, it gave up only grudgingly. Arnold left flyers at the library, at the diner. Rita posted one on the church bulletin board alongside the lost casserole dish notices. Arnold posted 3 times to the Facebook group. Sir Whiskerford, missing. Possibly offended by recent vacuuming incident. Last seen near the yew hedge. The messages that returned were gentle, kind, full of hope, and the sort of encouragement that felt slightly too optimistic, like they'd already prepared for the worst and didn't want to say it aloud. It was dawn on the 4th day. He'd woken early, habit or worry, or both. He sat on the porch, thermos next to him, a slice of deli. Turkey on a paper plate beside a soggy shoe mat. For peace offerings, not for nutrition. And then, in the trembling light of the morning, he heard it. A scritch, faint, irregular, like something negotiating with a rosebush and losing. Then, silence. Then, a shape. Squinting, Arnold saw it. Damp, bristled, slightly listing to one side like a ship that wasn't entirely seaworthy. Sir Whiskerford. He emerged not ceremoniously, but with a sort of battered resolve, as if returning from a valiant quest through unfriendly realms, his fur stuck up in angles normally only seen during nap interruptions. One ear was slightly torn in a way that looked dramatic but superficial. His gait had a wobble, and his face had an expression that clearly articulated, "We will never speak of this." Tucked in his mouth, like a ridiculous flag of triumph, was a single hot dog. Arnold released a noise somewhere between a sob and a giggle. Knees creaked as he kneeled on the porch and waited. Whiskerford paused, sniffed, then sauntered up the steps like nothing unusual had happened. He dropped a declaration of war refreshment at Arnold's feet and plopped down beside it with a weary thump. "I was worried," Arnold murmured, voice hitching. Whiskerford closed his eyes. The night was home. The mirror duel resumed the next day, like nothing had changed, as if he hadn't disappeared into the storm and taken Arnold's heart with him. He marched into the hallway, tail high, stared into the freestanding mirror with his signature disdain, and swatted it once, gently, like a man tipping his hat. To an old rival before the dance begins again, Arnold cried, quietly, nothing loud, nothing musical, just a steady unraveling, made bearable because it was laced with disbelief and relief and something very soft. The neighbors who joined the search heard and peeked through the screen door. "You okay?" Rita asked. Arnold didn't look up, just nodded and said, "He's back. That's more than okay." It wasn't just the cat who had come back. It was the rhythm. Imperfect, ridiculous, hilarious, the kind that made space in a house and in a heart. Later, Arnold scribbled an entry in the journal. Operation Windpaw concluded. Night returned with unknown provisions. Parliament reconvenes at dawn. And underneath that, some creatures find their way home by smell, or stars. This one found his way back through the sheer force of unfinished business. It happened without ceremony. No dramatic yowl. No echoing crash of claw on glass. No charge, no retreat. Just silence. And Sir Whiskerford sitting motionless in the hallway, right in front of the freestanding mirror, the very one that had for months served as his sworn nemesis. At first, Arnold didn't notice. He'd been in the kitchen, refilling a lukewarm mug of tea, his attention occupied by the muffled news on the radio and a crossword puzzle. It wasn't until he stepped into the hallway, looking for his slipper, which Whiskerford had previously claimed as a pillow, that he saw him. There he was, sitting squarely on the worn rug, tail curled neatly around his feet, staring at the mirror with quiet consideration. Arnold froze. He watched, waited, expecting at any second the familiar dance, the low crouch, the chin lift, the flurry of paws against a ghostly opponent. But none of it came. Instead, Whiskerford simply sighed, closed his eyes for a moment, opened them again, and let out a long, deep purr, a sound Arnold hadn't heard in days, not since the storm. For a moment, Arnold thought maybe he was confused. Maybe this was a standoff of a different kind, a calm before a very fluffy storm. But Whiskerford didn't move. His reflection did move, and the war, it seemed, was over. Arnold said nothing, only lowered himself slowly onto the nearby bench to watch it unfold. Or rather, not unfold. There was nothing left to watch, but an understanding passed between mirror and mirror maker. A quiet truce, honored not with flags or treaties, but with tolerance. That afternoon, Arnold wrote a final entry in the leather-bound journal. March 2nd. The knight did not draw his sword today. No hiss, no leap. He simply regarded his oldest foe and chose. Peace. The court of reflection hereby declares the war concluded. The enemy has become a companion. May misunderstandings rest and honor remain. He took a photo of Whiskerford, perched solemnly in front of the mirror, his tail flicking just once. He posted it later that day. No flourish, no witty caption, just 5 words. The war is over, finally. The response was overwhelming. Comments poured in, some silly, some sweet, all celebratory. Did Reflectionists sign the ceasefire? Does this mean the cat gets a pension? Show us the peace parade. Arnold chuckled as he read them all, replying carefully where he could. His favorite was from a woman in Kansas who'd followed the chronicles from the beginning. She wrote, "Maybe when we stop fighting our reflections, we start becoming whole again." Arnold didn't know if Whiskerford had tired of the battle or if some ancient feline realization had settled in, that the mirror was never an enemy, just another version of himself he hadn't understood until now. But the surrender, such as it was, brought with it something tender, not like defeat, not at all, more like rest. Arnold found himself looking at mirrors more these days. Not with judgment or rehearsal, not with the distance of a man unaccustomed to his own image, but with the same quiet curiosity Whiskerford had displayed that morning. A long look, a small smile, then back to the living. He didn't stop writing. The chronicles continued, just in a different direction now. Tales of diplomacy, of afternoon naps beside sunbeams, of dragon-shaped dust bunnies discovered under the pantry shelf. He wrote once, "Every night has their last war. What follows is the real adventure, learning how to be home." And Whiskerford? He still approached reflective surfaces, still stared, but with less venom, more contemplation. Occasionally, he'd paw at the mirror, not as an attack, but like a greeting, a checking in. Once he even took a long nap with his back against the base of it, as if to say, "This is a wall now, not a battlefield." And just like that, a weight that had once settled thick in the house, the grief, the stillness, the long absence of laughter, shifted, not vanished, but lighter, rewritten. Arnold began turning off the radio when he brewed tea, preferring the natural symphony, porch wind, teacup clink, and the occasional soft thunk of Whiskerford knocking over something he definitely wasn't supposed to be near. And mirrors? They stayed put, left wherever they were, unceremoniously. And that was the point. Reflective, silent, no longer anything to fear. They say that some endings don't feel like endings at all. More like beginnings with gentler footsteps. That's how it was after the war ended. Not with a banner or final trumpet, but with the soft, almost unnoticeable folding of everyday life into something whole again. Whiskerford's days found a new rhythm. Less battlefield, more domestic courtroom. He settled into routines both majestic and absurd, a noble perch atop the back cushion of the recliner, sunset patrols along the windowsills. The ceremonial unrolling of the hallway runner rug, which he accomplished each morning with 3 deliberate sideways leaps. Arnold never discouraged the behavior. He just learned to walk around it. The leather-bound journals continued to fill, line by careful line. Some entries as long as speeches, others just a sentence. One read, "Today the Duke of Dusterville was caught unprovoked in the laundry basket. No casualties. Compromise achieved via sardines." The house didn't just have sound again. It had laughter. The kind that arrives before you even realize you're smiling. Sometimes it was a laugh that came at his own expense, chuckling at the spectacle of a man his age crawling on all fours to retrieve a toy mouse. Other times it was sharper, less polished, tumbling out midlife like something uncaged. Arnold found his way back to people too. Not in crowds, but in gentle collisions. A conversation here, a nod there. It started with the ones who already knew him as the man with the cat, but it grew. He rejoined the community garden, dug up beds of mint and marigolds, and shared them in labeled jars. One he gifted to Eleanor at pharmacy. For headaches or heavy hearts, he wrote in faint pen. Whiskerford, for his part, took on something of a public schedule. Wednesdays at the senior center stretched gloriously across knit lap blankets. Fridays on the cafe patio, where he greeted passers-by with the air of a bored ambassador. The town welcomed the routine as much as they welcomed him. I don't know how he fits so much emotion into one tiny loaf shape, one of the teenagers at the library muttered once, handing him a drawing of Whiskerford holding a East Treaty shaped like sardine tins. Arnold smiled softly and said, "Practice." There were still quiet days. Days when the grief snuck in, not like an intruder, but like a guest he'd almost forgotten was coming. Those were the days Arnold let the mirror sit empty. Just turn the hallway light off and pass by. But even then, something about the still house didn't ache as it once had. Because even absence, now, came with footprints. He wrote once, "Love finds us through strange passages, sometimes as a voice, soft and familiar, other times as a clattering beast with fish breath and no sense of dignity. Either way, love finds us, whether we say yes or not." One morning he baked muffins, burnt the corners slightly, but added a note to the tin and left them on the town hall steps. The note read simply, "In thanks, from Whiskerford and his scribe." And the town responded, as small towns do. One day with a painted rock left on his front step, Whiskerford's likeness in exaggerated nobility. Another with a surprise delivery of a scratching post. Shaped like a lighthouse, he installed it in the living room. Watched the cat bat at the lookout tower with indifference. Watched again when he curled around its base to nap, lightly purring, content in a space no longer shaped by loss but by presence. Arnold didn't see himself as healed. Not exactly. Mourning, he realized, doesn't leave like a guest. It lingers, rearranges your furniture a bit, changes how you walk through doorways. But it doesn't mean you stop letting new things in. So he let in sunlight, conversations, scribbled poems, cupcakes from the neighbor boy who still insisted Whiskerford's diplomatic title was Colonel Tuna Snout. One evening, after the dishes were washed and the mail sorted badly, Arnold sat by the fire with a journal in his lap and Whiskerford at his feet. He wrote only a sentence. "He is the best ridiculous thing that ever happened to me." And somewhere between the pages, the chuckles, the slow healing, and the very soft purrs. That ridiculous thing had become something sacred, not for how he battled mirrors, but for how he brought back the man who once stopped smiling and taught him how to spot joy again, even in the uncanny quiet of a spoon.